Dr. Natalie Chen adjusted the delicate settings on her high-resolution digital scanner. The soft hum of the machine, a familiar sound in the quiet sanctuary of the conservation lab. Before her lay the next item in the queue, a collection of daguerreotypes from the museum's recently acquired and highly celebrated Montgomery collection. As the senior curator of photography at the National Museum of American History, Dr. Chen had processed thousands of historical images, each a frozen moment in time. But the next photograph made her expert hands still. It was an image from 1853. The photograph showed two teenage girls, seated side by side on an ornate wrought-iron bench on the veranda of a grand plantation house. On the left was a white girl, perhaps 14 years old, her blonde hair meticulously arranged in perfect corkscrew ringlets. She wore a formal Victorian dress, its intricate lace detailing speaking of immense wealth and status. To her right sat a black girl, slightly older, maybe 15. She, too, was dressed in a fine, elegant gown. Though less ornate than the first girl's, it was still remarkably sophisticated. A garment that defied easy explanation for an enslaved person, if that was, indeed, her station. Natalie leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "What an unusual composition for the era," she murmured to the silent room. "The casual proximity, the shared bench." It was a stark contrast to most period photographs, which depicted clear, uncompromising power dynamics. Master and servant, never two young girls presented as near equals. The established narrative, repeated in several academic publications, hailed this image as a rare, heartwarming example of interracial friendship in pre-Civil War Louisiana. But Natalie's instincts, honed by years of looking, tingled with a quiet dissonance. She carefully positioned the fragile, silver-coated plate in the scanner. As the enhanced digital image bloomed across her monitor, she began her methodical preservation check, zooming in to examine every minute detail. It was when her systematic gaze reached the lower portion of the image, just beneath the hem of the black girl's elegant dress, that her breath caught in her throat, a metallic glint, a sliver of something that shouldn't be there. "Wait a minute," she whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard to adjust the contrast and sharpness, pulling the elusive detail into devastating focus. What had initially appeared as a mere reflection, perhaps an anklet or a decorative shoe buckle, now revealed its true, horrifying nature. It was an ornate metal shackle, expertly disguised with delicate filigree and decorative elements to resemble a piece of jewelry. But its purpose was unmistakable. This was a restraint, a manacle, attached securely to the girl's ankle. A cold, profound chill ran through Natalie's entire body. The supposedly innocent image of friendship was instantly, irrevocably transformed into something far more sinister, a documentation of brutal captivity disguised as companionship. "Dr. Whitaker," she said aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the empty lab, "he needs to see this. Immediately." That evening, long after the museum had closed, Natalie sat at her desk, unable to shake the haunted expression she now recognized in the black girl's eyes. What she had previously catalogued as proper Victorian stoicism now screamed of resigned suffering, a silent scream hidden in plain sight for over 170 years. The following morning, the search for context began within the museum's own archives, a temperature-controlled basement labyrinth, a silent city of history organized in acid-free boxes and meticulously labeled drawers. Natalie spent hours searching, her determination a tangible force. "Here," she finally breathed, carefully extracting a yellowed folder containing the original acquisition notes from 1972, when the museum had first received the image from the Montgomery family descendants. The accompanying letter described it simply as Caroline Montgomery with her companion, Harriet, 1853. Dr. James Whitaker, the museum's director of historical research, now fully briefed, leaned over her shoulder, his expression grim. Companion, he repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. That's certainly a sanitized description. Look at this. Natalie pointed to a handwritten note attached to the original listing. The family claimed Harriet was a favored house servant who was treated almost as family. A common, self-justifying narrative, James remarked, his voice low. So, have you found anything about the ankle restraint? He asked. Nothing, Natalie replied, her frustration evident. It's not mentioned in any of the documentation. I don't think previous researchers even noticed it. They delved deeper into the financial records and sterile plantation inventories that had accompanied the Montgomery collection. Among the chillingly bureaucratic listings of human beings categorized as property, they found a specific entry from 1851. Purchased. Girl. Age 13. $800. Intended companion for Miss Caroline. Intended companion, James repeated slowly, letting the euphemism hang in the dusty air. That's quite specific. Then, in a personal diary belonging to Elizabeth Montgomery, Caroline's mother, they found the smoking gun. The entry read, "Acquired a suitable companion for Caroline today. The girl is well-mannered and speaks well. Caroline is delighted with her new friend. Though we've taken precautions to ensure she remains reliable, Thomas has crafted a special arrangement that is both secure and befitting her position." Natalie felt her stomach turn at the casual domestic cruelty of the passage. The special arrangement. They're describing the decorative shackle as if it were a privilege. Further entries only deepened the horror. Caroline and Harriet spent the afternoon reading together. Harriet's education is proving useful, though we must be careful not to let her forget her place. The gold filigree was a good choice, elegant enough for her to be seen with Caroline in public. This is worse than I thought, Natalie said, her voice tight with emotion. She wasn't just enslaved. She was forced to perform friendship while being literally chained. A pet slave for a lonely plantation daughter, James nodded, his face a mask of grim understanding. We need to look for other examples. If this was happening on the Montgomery plantation, it was likely occurring elsewhere. Their quest for truth led them next to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., a repository of thousands of narratives from formerly enslaved people, collected during the Federal Writers' Project of the 1930s. Natalie, armed with research access, spent days in methodical, determined searching, hoping to find any mention of Harriet or of similar soul-crushing companion arrangements on other plantations. And then she found it, a remarkable interview with an elderly woman named Harriet Johnson, recorded in 1937 in Chicago. The birth year, the Louisiana origins. It all matched the girl in the photograph. "Listen to this," Natalie said to James, who had joined her for this critical phase of the investigation. She read the transcript aloud. "I was purchased special to be a friend to the daughter, Miss Caroline. They dressed me fine, taught me to read some, though it was against the law. But don't let that fool you about kindness. I wore a gold chain on my ankle for 4 years, only removed when I was safely locked in my room at night." James leaned forward, his academic composure breaking under the weight of the discovery. "That has to be her. It has to be." The narrative continued, Harriet's voice from the past echoing with a powerful clarity. "They called it my special bracelet. Said it was a privilege to wear gold when other slaves wore iron. But a chain is a chain, no matter how pretty. Miss Caroline, She liked to pretend we were true friends. Maybe she even believed it. But friends don't own friends. Harriet described the relentless performance, speaking properly, dressing elegantly, accompanying Caroline everywhere, from meals to social events to lessons, all while being displayed as living proof of the Montgomery family's so-called enlightened benevolence. The decorative shackle was the guarantee that this living prop could never escape. The photographer came for Miss Caroline's 14th birthday. The narrative continued. They dressed me in one of my finest dresses, still plain next to hers, and posed us together. Miss Caroline was so proud of that picture, said it showed how special our friendship was, never saw that the chain on my ankle told the true story. The account detailed Harriet's eventual, hard-won escape during the chaos of the Civil War, her flight north, her marriage, the children she raised, and her ultimate decision, decades later, to share her story with the Federal Writers Project interviewer. She survived, Natalie said softly, feeling a profound cross-temporal connection to the girl in the photograph. She survived to tell her story. And now, James added, his voice firm with resolve, we can make sure it's heard. The final passage of Harriet's narrative struck Natalie with the force of a physical blow. People today might look at that picture and see two girls being friends, not knowing one was property to the other. That's how slavery worked. Sometimes it dressed itself up pretty, but underneath was always chains. The discovery of Harriet's own testimony electrified Natalie's research. If one such companion arrangement had been documented, others undoubtedly existed. She assembled a dedicated research team, bringing in Dr. Marcus Johnson, an expert on the nuanced practices of enslavement, and Emily Parker, a brilliant digital imaging specialist. We need to re-examine every supposedly friendly photograph of enslaved and free people together, Natalie explained during their first strategy meeting, her tone urgent. We'll be looking specifically at the lower portions of images, areas often cropped or ignored in published versions. Emily developed a sophisticated algorithm to scan the museum's vast digital archives for similar visual patterns. Formal portraits showing black and white individuals in close proximity, with a particular focus on children and young women. 2 weeks later, Emily reported her findings, her face serious as she presented a tablet with a carefully organized gallery of images. We've identified 43 potential matches, and in 7 of them, she zoomed in on the damning details, we can clearly identify disguised restraints, decorative shackles, chains masked as jewelry, even what appears to be a gold ribbon tied around an ankle that's actually a thin, unbreakable metal band. Marcus nodded grimly as he examined the accumulating evidence. This fits perfectly with my research on what plantation owners euphemistically called companionate enslavement, a particularly insidious practice where enslaved children were forced to serve not just as servants, but as emotional companions to white children. The psychological cruelty is staggering, Natalie observed, her heart aching. Forcing someone to perform friendship, to simulate affection, while keeping them in physical bondage. Their findings began to extend far beyond photography. Marcus uncovered plantation records from Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas that included specific, chilling references to companion acquisitions and appropriate restraint practices for house companions. A diary from a Virginia plantation mistress was particularly revealing. Purchased a bright young girl for Mary's companion. Had the silversmith craft an attractive chain that won't embarrass us when they appear together in society? The Black Moors were quite impressed with our arrangement and are seeking a companion for their own daughter. It was a status symbol, Marcus explained, deconstructing the brutal economics of it. Having an elegantly dressed, well-spoken, enslaved companion for your daughter demonstrated both immense wealth and a supposed benevolence, all while maintaining absolute physical control. The team discovered that these arrangements were particularly common for plantation daughters who were isolated on vast rural estates with few social opportunities with other white children of their class. The enslaved companions were forced to fill this emotional void, but always with the underlying, unyielding reality of ownership, maintained through these visible yet disguised restraints. These weren't exceptions or anomalies, Natalie concluded, her voice resonating with conviction as they compiled their overwhelming research. This was a recognized, documented practice, hiding in plain sight in our historical records and in our photograph albums all along. The conference room fell into a heavy, contemplative silence as Natalie finished presenting her team's exhaustive findings to the museum's powerful exhibition committee. The projected image of Harriet and Caroline remained illuminated on the large screen, the enhanced section clearly, unequivocally, showing the disguised shackle. This evidence completely changes how we must display and interpret this photograph, Natalie concluded, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the senior staff, and, potentially, dozens of others within our collection. Richard Townsend, the museum's senior director, looked deeply troubled. "This is powerful research, Dr. Chen. Truly. But we need to consider the implications very, very carefully." The Montgomery collection was donated with considerable funding for its preservation and exhibition. The Montgomery family descendants, I'll remind you, sit on our board. All the more reason to be truthful about what these images actually show, Natalie countered, her tone respectful but unyielding. This isn't just about one photograph, Richard. It's about correcting a fundamental and painful misrepresentation of history. Dr. Eliza Washington, the head of African American History Collections, leaned forward, adding her considerable authority to the debate. "I stand with Natalie. We have an ethical and scholarly responsibility to present these images with accuracy, especially given that we now have Harriet's own testimony. Anything less would be a perpetuation of the erasure of her experience and the experience of others like her." The debate raged for hours, concerns about donor relationships, potential controversy, and the challenges of reinterpreting long-established collection narratives were weighed against the uncompromising demands of historical truth and ethical curation. Finally, Richard turned to Natalie, his expression weary but intent. "What would you propose, specifically?" "A special exhibition," Natalie responded without a moment's hesitation, titled "Hidden in Plain Sight." It would be centered on the Montgomery photograph, but would include the other images we've identified. We present the original, sanitized interpretations alongside what we now understand to be the truth, the disguised restraints, the forced companionship, and, most importantly, Harriet's own words describing her experience. Eliza nodded her firm approval. We could include interactive elements, allowing visitors to discover the hidden details for themselves, just as Natalie did. It would be a powerful, experiential lesson in how history can be obscured and how we can learn to see it more clearly. "And we should include modern parallels," added Marcus, broadening the scope. "A commentary on how exploitation and control can still hide behind benevolent facades today. It's a call to action, urging us to look more carefully at historical narratives that seem too comfortable, too convenient." Richard sighed, visibly weighing the delicate balance of institutional politics against unwavering scholarly integrity. "The Montgomery family representatives will need to be informed before we proceed. That is non-negotiable." "Of course," Natalie agreed. "But they should be presented with our findings as established historical fact. not as a point of negotiation. The evidence is this. She gestured toward the haunting image on the screen. As the meeting finally adjourned, Natalie lingered in the quiet room, her eyes fixed on the projected face of Harriet. "We owe her this truth," she said quietly, though no one remained to hear her. It was a promise. The elegant wood-paneled conference room at the law offices of Hartwell and Reed felt imposing, a space designed for power and negotiation. Natalie sat beside Director Townsend, facing 3 representatives of the Montgomery family and their sharply dressed attorney. "This is preposterous," declared Eleanor Montgomery Williams, a silver-haired woman in her 70s, her voice sharp with indignation. "You're defaming my ancestors based on what? A shadow in an old photograph?" Natalie remained calm, opening her tablet to display the meticulously enhanced image. "It's not a shadow, Ms. Montgomery Williams. It's clearly a decorative restraint, and we have Harriet's own testimony, describing it in her own words." "Oh, some unverified interview with an old woman who claimed to be this Harriet person," Eleanor scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "How can you possibly verify that?" "The details match precisely," Natalie explained, her voice steady. "The dates, the names, the location, even the specific description of the gold filigree restraint. Additionally, we found your great-great-grandmother's own diary entries describing the arrangement." Eleanor blanched slightly at this revelation. A crack in her formidable composure, Richard attempted diplomacy. "We understand this is difficult information to process. The museum isn't attempting to single out your family. We've discovered similar practices were, in fact, relatively common among elite families. My ancestors were respected members of Louisiana society," Eleanor insisted, her voice tightening. "They treated their people well. For the times." "With respect," Marcus interjected, his tone that of a scholar stating a fact. "Forcing a young girl to pretend friendship while keeping her physically shackled isn't treating someone well by any era's moral standards." The Montgomery family's attorney cleared his throat, entering the fray. "The donation agreement gives the family certain rights regarding how these materials are displayed. We could pursue an injunction, if necessary." "You could," Richard acknowledged, meeting the lawyer's gaze squarely. "But that would merely delay the inevitable. Dr. Chen's research is academically sound and will be published regardless in a major historical journal. The question is whether your family wishes to be part of an honest historical reckoning or prefers to be seen as attempting to suppress an uncomfortable truth." A tense silence filled the room, broken by a younger Montgomery relative who had been quiet until now. "Grandmother," he said softly, perhaps we should consider a different approach. Times have changed since the collection was first donated. Maybe it's time our family changed, too." After several more hours of tense, difficult negotiation, a fragile compromise emerged. The Montgomery family would not block the exhibition, but would be allowed to include a brief contextual statement acknowledging that while their ancestors participated in a morally unacceptable system, they were, in their view, products of their time and place. As they were leaving the somber law office, Eleanor Montgomery Williams stopped Natalie, her eyes hard. "You think you're doing something noble, young lady," she said, her voice low, "but you're just stirring up painful history better left buried." Natalie met her gaze steadily, without malice, but with absolute resolve. "Harriet couldn't tell her story while she was chained to that bench," she replied, "but she lived to make sure it was recorded. Don't you think she deserves at long last to be heard?" With the Montgomery family negotiations behind them, Natalie's team poured all their energy into expanding the research and building the exhibition the museum had given its full approval, and Hidden in Plain Sight, Captive Companions, and the Performance of Friendship was scheduled to open in 6 months. "Look at this," Emily called out from her workstation one afternoon, her voice charged with excitement. She had been analyzing a collection of letters between plantation families. There's an entire correspondence network between the Montgomerys and the Whitfield family in Georgia, specifically about the companionship arrangement. They were sharing tips. The letters revealed a web of elite families who had adopted these practices, with Elizabeth Montgomery apparently pioneering the decorative restraint concept, which was then copied by other plantation mistresses who saw it as a refined solution to the management of their human property. Meanwhile, Marcus had been tracking financial records. "I've found specialized purchases from jewelers and silversmiths," he reported, showing them ledger entries specifically for decorative anklets and companion bracelets. Some even include design specifications, noting they must be secure and unremovable without a key. The team discovered that these arrangements were most common among the wealthiest families with daughters between 10 and 16. The enslaved companions were typically slightly older, selected for their perceived intelligence and appearance, and were often granted privileges like fine clothing and basic literacy, always with the underlying control maintained through both physical restraints and profound psychological manipulation. "It's a particularly gendered form of enslavement," observed Dr. Washington, reviewing their findings. "These girls were expected to provide not just service, but emotional labor. They had to appear genuinely attached, genuinely happy. They had to perform humanity while being denied its most basic right: freedom." In old auction records, they found chilling evidence that enslaved children advertised as suitable companions commanded significantly higher prices. Listings specifically mentioned well-mannered, refined features, or a pleasing temperament, all euphemisms for children who could convincingly play the role of a friend. Most disturbingly, they found that photographs of plantation daughters with their companions were often featured prominently in family albums, proudly presented as evidence of the family's supposed benevolence. In many cases, the restraints were carefully positioned to remain just out of frame, or were so expertly disguised as decorative elements that they became invisible to the uncritical eye. They weren't even hiding these arrangements, Natalie realized, a fresh wave of revulsion washing over her. They were proud of them. They displayed them. They saw them as enlightened, Marcus added, his voice thick with disdain. The ultimate display of power. Not just owning someone's body, but claiming ownership of their emotions, their very relationships, forcing them to simulate friendship while ensuring they could never, for a single second, forget they were property. This deeper understanding added profound layers of complexity to their exhibition planning. It was no longer just about exposing hidden shackles in photographs. It was about revealing an entire, systemic practice of emotional exploitation that had been meticulously scrubbed from the mainstream historical narrative. The research team expanded their search nationally, reaching out to other institutions and private archives. Their inquiries generated both keen interest and staunch resistance, as curators and collectors grappled with the implications for their own holdings. The Historical Society of Louisiana has identified 3 more images with similar characteristics, Emily reported during a weekly progress meeting, and they found an estate inventory that specifically lists companion restraints among the family valuables. As word of their groundbreaking project spread through academic circles, Natalie began receiving emails from researchers who had noticed similar anomalies, but hadn't possessed the framework to understand their full significance. A clear, disturbing pattern was emerging across the antebellum South, concentrated among the wealthiest, most cultured plantation families. Dr. Washington, conducting parallel oral history research, found more voices from the past. I've found 11 accounts from formerly enslaved people that describe similar situations, she announced. While not all mention decorative restraints specifically, they talk about being locked in at night, or about wearing specific tokens that mark them as belonging exclusively to the daughter of the house. The most powerful breakthrough came when they managed to locate a living descendant of another companion. Gloria Thompson's great-great-grandmother, Rachel, had been forced into a nearly identical arrangement with the daughter of a Virginia tobacco planter. "My grandmother passed down Rachel's story," Gloria explained during a recorded interview, her voice rich with the weight of inherited memory. How she had to dress up and play with little Miss Charlotte every day, but wasn't allowed to speak to the other enslaved children because she might pick up their common ways. She slept on a pallet in Miss Charlotte's room, chained to the bed frame every single night. Then Gloria presented them with a breathtaking, tangible piece of history. She had preserved the very object itself, a decorative gold cuff with a clever, hidden internal locking mechanism, passed down through generations as a sacred relic of a painful past. "Rachel kept this after she escaped during the war," Gloria said softly, her fingers hovering over the heirloom. "She said she never wanted her children, or her children's children, to forget what pretty things can sometimes hide." The cuff was nearly identical to the one visible in the Montgomery photograph. It was definitive proof that these were not one-off creations, but manufactured items, part of a recognized and sickening trade. As their research database swelled, they identified over 60 clear examples of the practice, spanning from the 1830s right up to the Civil War, concentrated among the elite in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Louisiana. The physical evidence, combined with written records and searing oral testimonies, now painted a comprehensive and undeniable picture of a widespread, yet previously unrecognized aspect of slavery's insidious machinery of psychological control. "Each of these photographs," Natalie observed, her voice hushed as she reviewed the haunting gallery of images, "tells the same devastating story, a story of a friendship that was never a friendship at all. Of chains disguised as jewelry. Of childhood stolen and replaced with a forced, endless performance." The exhibition was taking shape, not merely as a revelation about hidden restraints in old photographs, but as a powerful, immersive exploration of how history itself often conceals its darkest aspects behind the most seemingly innocent of images. The National Museum of American History buzzed with a palpable sense of anticipation on the opening night of Hidden in Plain Sight, Captive Companions. Media representatives, esteemed academics, donors, and members of the public filled the specially designed gallery space, a quiet murmur of expectation hanging in the air. The centerpiece was a dramatically enlarged version of the Montgomery plantation photograph, now accompanied by an interactive light that, with the press of a button, brilliantly illuminated the disguised shackle, making the invisible undeniable. Surrounding it were the other identified photographs, their own hidden restraints revealed through careful enhancement and thoughtful, respectful presentation. Beside each image were the stories of the enslaved girls, drawn from historical records, plantation diaries, and, where they existed, their own powerful first-person testimonies. Harriet's narrative featured prominently, her words displayed in elegant, sober typography alongside the photograph where she had been forced to pose as a friend. "We're not just showing you what was hidden in these photographs," Natalie explained to a reporter from the Washington Post, her voice carrying through the gallery. "We're revealing how history itself can hide disturbing truths behind seemingly innocent images. These girls were required to perform friendship, to offer emotional companionship, While being physically restrained and psychologically manipulated, their truth has been hiding in plain sight for generations. The exhibition included Gloria Thompson's family heirloom, the golden restraint cuff, displayed in a central, softly lit case. Visitors could examine its beautiful, ornate exterior and then see a diagram of the hidden locking mechanism that transformed a piece of jewelry into a tool of captivity. At a digital interactive station, people could examine unaltered historical photographs and, by touching the screen, discover the hidden restraints for themselves, creating their own personal moments of shocking revelation, mirroring Natalie's original discovery. Reactions from the crowd were powerful and visceral. Some visitors wept openly as they read the personal testimonies. Others engaged in hushed, intense discussions about historical memory and responsibility. A few descendants of plantation families expressed discomfort or defensiveness, while descendants of enslaved people sought out the curators to thank them, with tears in their eyes, for finally telling this hidden chapter of their ancestors' lives. Eleanor Montgomery Williams attended with several younger family members, her expression an unreadable mask throughout the evening. Natalie noticed one of the younger Montgomery women, Eleanor's own granddaughter, openly crying as she stood before Harriet's testimony. Most powerfully of all, descendants of the identified companions had been invited as honored guests. Gloria Thompson stood proudly beside the case containing her ancestors' restraint, patiently explaining its significance to clusters of rapt visitors. "Rachel wanted us to remember," she told them, her voice clear and strong. "Not to hold on to bitterness, but to be able to recognize the truth, especially when others try to pretty it up and disguise it." As the successful evening began to wind down, Director Townsend approached Natalie, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. The board chairman just called it the most significant historical reframing this museum has undertaken in decades. He paused, then added, "Worth all the controversy, wouldn't you say?" Natalie's gaze drifted across the gallery, coming to rest on a young black girl who was studying Harriet's photograph with an expression of deep, thoughtful intensity. "Absolutely worth it," Natalie replied, her heart full. 1 year after the exhibition opened to national acclaim, Natalie sat in her office, reviewing a comprehensive report on its profound impact. Hidden in plain sight had traveled to 7 major museums across the country, sparking similar research projects and forcing a sweeping re-evaluation of historical photography collections nationwide. The academic paper she had co-authored with Marcus and Dr. Washington had been published in the American Historical Review, generating both acclaim and productive scholarly debate. Over 40 additional companion photographs had been identified by other researchers using their methodology, creating a robust and damning body of evidence. Most significantly, the project had inspired a broader movement to re-examine all seemingly benign historical narratives and images for hidden evidence of oppression and resistance. Museums and universities were now actively developing new, more critical protocols for analyzing historical photographs, learning to look beyond the obvious, to find the profound stories concealed in the details, in the margins, in the shadows. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. A young intern entered, carrying a small, carefully wrapped package. "This was delivered for you, Dr. Chen," the intern said. "It's from someone named Eliza Montgomery." Natalie recognized the name, Eleanor's granddaughter, the one who had been so visibly moved at the exhibition opening. With careful, almost reverent hands, Natalie opened the package. Inside was a fragile, leather-bound volume and a brief, handwritten note. "Dr. Chen," it read, "I found this in my grandmother's effects after her passing last month. It's Caroline Montgomery's personal diary, from 1853 to 1855. I believe it belongs in your research collection, not hidden away in our family attic. Eliza. With the utmost care, Natalie opened the fragile diary. Caroline's girlish, looping handwriting filled the pages, documenting her daily life with Harriet. The entries revealed a complex, tragic relationship, filled with moments of what seemed like genuine childish affection, juxtaposed with jarring expressions of unthinking ownership and control. Caroline had been both companion and captor, her own perspective utterly shaped by the brutal society that taught her to see the ownership of another human being as natural, even benevolent. One entry, near the middle of the volume, stood out with piercing clarity. Harriet looked sad today. I told her she's lucky to be my friend instead of working in the fields like the others. She said nothing, but I saw her touching her ankle chain when she thought I wasn't looking. Sometimes I wish she didn't have to wear it, but Mother says it's necessary I gave her a ribbon to tie around it, to make it prettier. Natalie closed the diary slowly, feeling the immense weight of its significance. This was the final, crucial piece of the story. Caroline's perspective added yet another profound dimension to their understanding. This was not a simple tale of cartoonish villains and pure victims, but a complex human tragedy in which even the privileged were themselves trapped, shaped, and corrupted by a fundamentally cruel and dehumanizing system. She would add the diary to their growing archive, ensuring that both Harriet's voice and Caroline's voice were preserved for future scholars. This, she realized, was the true, enduring power of their work, not just in exposing the hidden chains, but in revealing, with compassion and clarity, the full, complicated humanity of all involved, all trapped in different ways by history's most terrible and enduring bindings. As she placed Caroline's diary carefully into a new, acid-free archival box, Natalie's eyes drifted to a framed reproduction of the photograph that had started it all, hanging on her office wall. A seemingly innocent image of two young girls on a sunny veranda. An image that, once truly seen, could never be viewed as innocent again. It was, she thought, just like history itself.